the Secretary of State for that. And in considering city and growth deals, he knows that this is about economic growth and ensuring prosperity within Northern Ireland. Is he aware of the concerns amongst businesses in England and Wales and Scotland who are now saying that as a result of the general product safety standards emanating from the European Union, that they cannot send their products to Northern Ireland, in stark contrast to the British Government's position to maintain standards on CE markings with the European Union? And what advice and support can he give those businesses who want to trade within their own country and consumers in Northern Ireland who want to buy from within their own country but are currently frustrated from doing so?
Well, advice is being provided about the general product safety regulation. Many companies already meet the terms of it because they are exporting from the UK to the European Union. So there are steps that some businesses will have to take. But I hope the impact of that is going to be very small because there is a way to get through it.
Smith.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister. Why, please.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 8, 10 and 12 together. White Ribbon Day this week marks the start of 16 days of activism against violence against women and girls. The scale of this violence in our country is unacceptable, and this government is treating it as the national emergency that it is. Every woman and girl deserves to feel safe wherever she is. The scale of violence against women and girls is unacceptable. That's why the Labour government has set out our ambition to halve violence against women and girls within a decade. The government wants to take a joined-up approach across the UK, and I have discussed this issue with the First and Deputy First Ministers and Deputy Prime Minister together. We will continue to work collaboratively with the Executive.
Look, we want to get to PMQs, and I'm going to achieve it at this rate. David Smith.
Thank the Minister for that reply. According to Women's Aid, a fifth of all crime in Northern Ireland is domestic abuse. But we know that paramilitary organisations make reporting, confronting or escaping such abuse even more difficult. How is the Government working with the Northern Ireland Executive to break down these coercive barriers to support for women and girls?
I'd like to thank the member for raising this. Alongside the alarming femicide statistics, there are additional factors that add to the complexity of gender-based violence in Northern Ireland, which are very important to recognise and take action to present. Paramilitarism is one of those. We need to tackle the grip of paramilitaries to end this abuse.
Minister Sir
Mr. Speaker, the theme of this year's White Ribbon Day is "It starts with men." Would the Minister agree with me that it is incumbent on all of us, and especially men, to play our part in stamping out violence against women and girls wherever we find it? And how is she working with the Executive in Northern Ireland to deliver on our shared mission to do exactly that?
Thank you, and I'm delighted to see so many men raising this issue today here in Northern Ireland Questions. Absolutely, we all have a role to play. Yesterday I met with Tani McCorry from White Ribbon, Northern Ireland, who's working with men in football teams, GAA teams and in prisons. We all have a role to play to have those difficult conversations to really change our society.
Chris Bloor.
Mr. Speaker, the Northern Ireland Executive Strategic Framework to End Violence Against Women and Girls acknowledges the rise of online influencers who have a toxic influence on men and boys. Can the Minister provide an update and discussion she has had on sharing best practice on how to challenge these influencers and promote healthier and safer attitudes towards consent and relationships across the UK?
I'm very supportive of the Executive's framework, the strategic framework to tackle violence against women and girls. I'm in constant dialogue with organisations like White Ribbon NI to learn and share best practice. That's how we're going to achieve this, in partnership with the Executive. And the Government is also committed to tackling online abuse and violence against women and girls with the Online Safety Act and further work that we'll be doing on this.
Jim Shannon.
I know that's not for me, but
well deserved.
Ministers, in Northern Ireland last year, 6 women were murdered by men. They've all been arrested and their cases are pending. 800 women and children stayed in the Women's Aid Refuge, and last year in the Women's Refuge 10 babies were born. There's an epidemic of violence against women in Northern Ireland. What can the Minister of State do in discussions with those at Northern Ireland Assembly to make it better? Thank you so much.
I'd like to pay tribute to all of the women's aides across Northern Ireland. They do absolutely fantastic work. So it's prevention, it's provision of services, it's tackling online abuse and tackling abuse and violence against women and girls wherever we see it, by everyone in this House and across the UK. That's the only way that we're going to really change this situation.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree that the low number of police officers in Northern Ireland hinders the fight against violence against women and girls? And will she work with the Executive to ensure that the number of officers increased to the 7,500 recommended?
The action by police officers is absolutely fundamental, and looking at how we can change the justice system, as we are doing across the UK as our target to halve violence against women and girls, is essential. But it's much more than that. It's about a whole of society change. It's about tackling misogyny wherever we see it. It's about every organisation getting involved in this. So actions by the police are one part of this, but it's so much more than that.
Can the Minister make one?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following on from Honourable Friend's question, key to reducing violence against women and girls is, of course, effective policing. That was a clear commitment in New Decade, New Approach. By when does the Minister expect the policing numbers in Northern Ireland to reach those levels set out in that commitment?
In the budget recently, this government provided a record-breaking devolution settlement of £18.2 billion, with £640 million this year, £1.5 million next year, and it's up to the Chief Constable now to be spending those figures.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Daisy Cooper.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the sympathies of everyone in this House will be with those affected by the devastating flooding that we've seen recently. And our thanks goes to all those working tirelessly to support the affected communities. Mr. Speaker, we've committed £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to build, maintain and repair vital defences to protect more communities from the awful impact of the flooding. Mr. Speaker, the ceasefire announced in Lebanon is long overdue, but demonstrates that diplomacy can succeed even in the most challenging of circumstances. We must seize this opportunity to build trust, de-escalate tensions and push for a wider ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself with those remarks of those of the Prime Minister? West Hertfordshire Hospital Trust has eliminated 65-week waits, and they have now met all 3 national cancer standards. These remarkable achievements by the staff are happening despite the fact that they are working in terrible buildings that are life expired and crumbling. If the government is looking for a project that is high-performing and shovel-ready, this is it. So will the Prime Minister give our trust the green light to build a new hospital without any further delay?
I thank her for raising the issue and obviously of importance to her constituents and beyond. Look, the new hospital programme that we inherited was a failure of the previous government. We are committed to delivering. We're reviewing to make sure we can deliver. The Health Secretary set out further details, but I'm very happy for her to have a meeting with the relevant minister if she wants to follow up on the specifics. Thank you.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents in Red House Park in my constituency are suffering from soaring management fees and poor service from their leaseholder management company. Recent BBC reporting has once again demonstrated the consequences of the outdated and feudal leasehold system. All of them are frustrated by the broken promises of the previous government, so will the Prime Minister reassure them that this government will introduce legislation as soon as possible to resolve the leaseholder and leaseholder crisis?
Mr. Speaker, yes, we will do so. I agree that the last government totally failed to tackle the unfairness of the leasehold system. We will provide homeowners with more powers, protection and greater rights by bringing that legislation forward. Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the CBI conference on Monday, The Chancellor said, and I quote, "I'm clear, I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes." I know that telling the truth to this House is important to the Prime Minister. So will he repeat his Chancellor's pledge now?
Mr. Speaker, we set out our position at the budget that was just set out. We're fixing the foundations. We're dealing with the £22 billion black hole that they left. I'm not going to write the next 5 years of budgets here at this dispatch box. But, Mr. Speaker, we said we wouldn't hit the pay slips of working people. We passed the budget, we invest in the future, and we kept that promise.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, he's not fixing any foundations, he's making everything worse. The whole House would have heard him refuse to repeat the Chancellor's pledge, a pledge as worthless as the manifesto promises that he's talking about. If he is fixing foundations, why is it that the PMI index shows that business confidence has crashed since the budget?
Mr. Speaker, we're fixing the foundation. We've got record investment into this country. But she talks about tax rises. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, she stood there and said that she wanted all the investment, all the benefits of the budget, but she didn't know how she was going to pay for it. I noticed that, having come here criticising the national insurance rises over and over again, on Monday she admitted that she wouldn't reverse the position that we set out. Meanwhile, her Science Minister was saying he was going energetically to do the opposite. They really haven't got a clue what they're doing.
Mr. Speaker, if he wants to know what Conservatives would do, he should resign and find out. Until then...
I'll decide when there's more.
Mr. Speaker, until then, I'm the one asking the questions. There's a petition out there, 2 million people asking him to go. He's the one who doesn't know. He's the one who doesn't know how things work. It is not government that creates growth, Mr. Speaker. It is business. His employment secretary, I don't see her here, she wants more young people in work. But businesses say they are cutting jobs because of the Chancellor's budget. His Deputy Prime Minister, she is not here. Her employment rights bill will stop businesses hiring. That's what they say. The CBI said on Monday that the dots of the government's policy don't join up. They're right, aren't they?
Mr. Speaker, on Monday she said that she wouldn't reverse the increase in national insurance. Yesterday, on their legacy legislation, their predecessor, they couldn't decide what their position was. Today, they've launched a policy commission asking other people to give them some ideas for government. And she talks about a petition. We had a massive petition on the 4th of July in this country. We spent years taking our party from a party of protest to a party of government. They're hurtling in the opposite direction.
What a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. We had a budget in March this year, and tractors were not blockading the streets of Whitehall afterwards. So let me give him another example of a real business. Following his budget, the head of McVitie's has said that it has been harder to understand what the case for investment in the UK is. So while the Prime Minister has been hobnobbing in Brazil, businesses have been struggling to digest his budget. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Employment Rights Bill shows that it is not only the ginger nut that is causing him problems?
I was attending the G20. I suspect on their current trajectory they don't know whether they're going to attend the G20 or not. Maybe the Policy Commission will come up with an answer on that one. But we've had record investment from overseas investment into this country. And she keeps carping from the sidelines. She says at this dispatch book, she wants all the benefits of the budget, all the investment, but she doesn't want to pay for any of it. Mr. Speaker, she's racked up £6.7 billion of unfunded commitments in just 3 weeks as leader of the opposition. So once the cabinet of the economy, we're the ones growing the economy.
Mr. Speaker, the investment he's taking credit for was our work. I was business secretary. We appreciated those deals that he announced. But the bottom line is that in all that he has said, he doesn't seem to care about the young people who will lose their jobs as a result of his budget. Perhaps he can show more concern for the 1,100 people who found out yesterday that they could lose their jobs at Vauxhall's plant in Luton. So while he flies around making unilateral commitments, back home, the real-world effects are businesses closing in Bedfordshire and Basildon. Does the Prime Minister stand by his promise to ban the sale of petrol cars by 2030, even if more jobs will be lost?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, obviously engaging with them. I would remind the Leader of the Opposition that the EV mandates that are an issue in this particular case were actually introduced by the last government. I would also remind her that she was the Business Secretary that introduced them. We're getting on with supporting those communities. She's shouting from the sideline.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, he clearly didn't read his briefing about the EV mandate. The fact is, we changed the date and made it easier for people. Everything he has done is attack people. The budget was an attack on farmers, an attack on workers, an attack on pensioners, an attack on the young, and an attack on thousands of charities and businesses across the country. The whole system is broken, Mr. Speaker, and he is making things worse. He is making things worse. Mr. Speaker, he is making things worse. Everyone is unhappy. Isn't it a good thing that the Chancellor is an expert at customer complaints?
Mr. Speaker, I think she's just read out the charge sheet against the last government. Everything is broken. And they come here every week with absolutely nothing to offer except complaints. Nothing constructive, no new ideas. They don't know what they're doing from one day to the next. Living in this fantasy world that everything was fine, apparently, for 14 years. Well, the country's fed up with those fantasies. They've got rid of those fantasies. We're going to take the hard decisions. They're jumping on every bandwagon that's passing. We're taking the country forward.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we enter the last week of Islamophobia Awareness Month, the Prime Minister will know that this year has been an extraordinarily difficult for British Muslims on the receiving end of society's most deplorable attitudes, considered easy prey for the far right and scapegoated by politicians endorsing institutional Islamophobia. And the reality is this emboldening and normalisation of Islamophobia, as highlighted in a number of reports, led to the race riots we saw on the streets of Britain this summer, where mosques and those who are visibly Muslim were subject to despicable attacks, with many left fearing for their lives. So will the Prime Minister condemn those in public office and positions of power who actively promote Islamophobia? Will he commit to adopting a definition today? And will he further outline what concrete steps the government is taking to rip out Islamophobia at its roots, including in this place?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise Islamophobia, and there's been a concerning rise in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism over recent months, and we are committed to tackling all forms of hatred, and we will work with others on an ongoing basis to make sure that we do. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about the terrible impact of Storm Bert with all the flooding? Our thoughts are with all those affected, with thanks to our amazing emergency services. Mr. Speaker, Christine's father was told that he needed end-of-life care, but after a few days it was removed due to funding cuts. He was told that he wouldn't get it, and he died a few weeks later in excruciating pain. Christine said it was terrible to watch him suffer. Does the Prime Minister agree that whatever the House decides on Friday, it is urgent that we improve access to high-quality end-of-life care? And will he make that a key focus of the 10-year NHS plan? And will he commit now to protect hospices from the national insurance rise?
I thank you for raising that case, and I think the thoughts of the whole House with the family involved. And, Mr Speaker, obviously there's a very important vote on Friday, but whichever way that vote goes, we must invest properly in care across our health service. And that's why, in addition to putting the NHS back on its feet, we're putting forward a 10-year plan to make sure the NHS can give the care that everybody would expect across the spectrum, including end-of-life care.
Sir Ed David.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for that reply, and I hope we'll hear more from ministers, particularly on hospices and national insurance, in days to come. Turning to the cost of living crisis, on Friday, Ofgem said that in January, energy bills would go up again after last month's 10% rise. Millions of people are really worried about how they're going to make ends meet this winter, not least hundreds of thousands of pensioners who are in poverty but above the pension credit limit, who will now lose winter fuel payments. So with energy bills going up again, will the Prime Minister reconsider and restore winter fuel payments?
Well, Mr Speaker, obviously the whole House is concerned about energy bills, which are actually lower this year than they were last year. The long-term way to deal with this is clean power by 2030 to make sure we drive those energy bills down on a permanent basis. And that's what we will do. On the winter fuel allowance, he knows very well what the government's position is, and I've rehearsed it, indeed, with him many times.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Antisocial behaviour involving modified and off-road bikes is a menace that has a huge impact on communities like mine in Sunderland. While I welcome the work Northumbria Police do in partnership with our council on this issue, they need stronger powers and more resources. Can the Prime Minister outline how he will back the police to tackle the misery caused by intimidating and downright dangerous antisocial behaviour on bikes?
Well, I thank him for raising this, because antisocial behaviour affects so many people. Sometimes it's described to me as low level. It isn't in the impact it has, particularly when it comes to off-road bikes. And that's why we're implementing tough new respect orders, which will give powers to the police, including powers to seize off-road bikes, but crucially adds a power of arrest for breach of the orders, something that's been missing in recent years. So we will tackle this because it blights communities across the country.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As everyone in the House will be aware, we're currently in the middle of BBC Anti-Scam Awareness Week. And of course, the advice in that context is always simple. If you see a scam, you should report it. So with that in mind, can the Prime Minister advise the House? Is he aware of anyone who's promised to reduce energy bills only for them to increase? Is he aware of anyone who promised to back business only to tax business? And is he aware of anyone who promised to protect pensioners only to pick their pockets for their winter fuel allowance?
Well, it's very good to see.
Sorry. The gallery will not clap and not interrupt the proceedings. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm very glad to see him in his seat in this House, as I'm sure many of his colleagues in Scotland share that sentiment. What I can point to is a government in Scotland that promised to take Scotland forward and took them backwards. So I can identify the first one. It's right there.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division. including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sarah and her family have farmed beef and cattle in my Gordon and Buchan constituency for over 70 years, and they'd always planned for her sister to continue the family legacy. Earlier this year, Sarah's mother died very suddenly and unexpectedly, and she was just 58. Sarah said to me that despite already having a tragic year, it was made even worse after the budget, saying that changes to agricultural property relief has hit us hard when we're already struggling with bereavement and trying to cope with losing mum. What would the Prime Minister say to Sarah and her family on what has been the most difficult year of their lives, in light as well of the family farm tax?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to her for raising the case and the awful bereavement. And if she would kindly send me the details of the case, then I'll certainly have a look at it. In relation to farming more broadly, as she knows, £5 billion was set aside in the budget over the next 2 years as an investment in farming. That's the biggest amount that's ever been set aside. I hear the chuntering, but they actually failed to spend the last farming budget by £300 million. On the question of inheritance and family farms, obviously it's important to bear in mind in a typical case, which is parents passing to a child, the threshold is £3 million, and that is why, as she knows, the vast majority of farms will be totally unaffected.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Southwark faces a significant challenge of antisocial behaviour, but fewer police today than in 2010 due to Tory cuts in coalition with the Lib Dems. As the Prime Minister fixes the postcode lottery and law and order, will he consider the request from Southwark Police, Southwark Council and myself for our community to be a pilot test area for the new respect orders to address this serious problem?
Well, I'm grateful for him for raising this, because public has been badly eroded under the last government, and we will drive that up with a major programme of reform. That includes recruiting 13,000 more police into neighbourhood policing and the tough new respect orders, coupled with the power to arrest for breach of the order.
Rupert Mill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sincerely hope that all of us in this House agree that good government is transparent government. In response to my written question on publishing the number of foreign nationals receiving universal credit, I was informed by a Department of Work and Pensions Minister that the feasibility of developing suitable official statistics was being examined. Will the Prime Minister today commit to using his good offices to publish this data transparently?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this, and I know there's been an exchange on it, and as soon as I've got an update for him, I will provide that for him so that he's got it. Thank you.
Waverley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within weeks of a Labour government, the government delivered for the mine workers in the mine workers pension scheme. It was so well received, and it was justice done. However, is it not time to seek the truth with regards to the policing during the miners' strike? And would the Prime Minister commit to an early and full inquiry into the policing during the miners' strike, something which this lot denied for generations?
Well, I'm grateful for him for raising this. That question of the mine workers' pension scheme reversed a historic injustice, and I was so pleased we were able to do that in the budget. In relation to the miners' strike, as I think he knows, I've met some of the Orgreave campaigners and listened very carefully to what they say. They are entitled to the truth, and we're thinking carefully about what the next step should be in order to deliver that for them.
Member Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next month marks 2 years since the death of Cody Fisher, a young man from my constituency of Stratford-on-Avon. Cody was a talented footballer with a bright future whose life was tragically cut short when he was stabbed in a nightclub in Birmingham. His mother, Tracy, has been campaigning tirelessly in his memory for legislation which would require venues to wear bleed kits and metal detectors. In the light of the government's commitment to tackling knife crime, will the Prime Minister meet with Tracy and me to discuss these vital proposals to better protect young people like Cody from the devastating impact of knife crime.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for raising the tragic case and pay tribute to Tracy for her campaigning. I've met a number of families on this issue of bleed kits, so I know firsthand just how important it is. We are taking measures in relation to knife crime, which includes banning the sale of online knives, making less available, of course, to take young people out of offending where we can, and real penalties. But I am happy to look at bleed kits, and I will make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to hear more of what we're doing, but also to make her case.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr Speaker, and I refer to my register of interests. The proposed closure of Luton's Vauxhall van plant by Stellantis is devastating news for our town.
Yeah.
Over 1,000 jobs at risk and the future prosperity of our town threatened. So can the Prime Minister assure me there will be cross-departmental response to support the automotive sector, but importantly, good skilled jobs in Luton?
Yes, I will, and I know, and thank her for raising this, because it is a difficult and uncertain time for workers in Luton and her constituents and their families. And that's why we're working with the industry. There will in fact be a statement later on today, Mr Speaker, about this. It's important we do whatever we can to support these communities.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tenbury Wells was flooded again with Storm Bert last weekend, the second time the town has been flooded this year, and it's a town where it's only a case of when, not if, it will flood again. And the situation is made even more devastating for residents because there is a fully developed flood defence plan that is partly funded for the town. And the budget carried forward £2.4 billion for flood defences. Can the Prime Minister commit to be able to use his offices to finally get this scheme built and to fix the foundations of Tenbury Wells?
I'm grateful to her for raising this, which is an awful situation for her constituents. We all know how devastating flooding is, the initial damage that it caused, but then the ongoing damage, including problems then of insurance, etc., that then prevail for many, many years. We are committed to tackling this. That's why we set aside the money that we did in the budget, and I'll happily arrange for her to have a meeting with the relevant minister to look at the particular details of her case. But I thank her for raising it, because I do know for her constituents it's such an important issue.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last weekend in Cwmtaleiri, torrential rain caused a landslip. Slurry, even boulders, poured down streets. People were afraid. The Chancellor just agreed a welcome £25 million for coal tip movements in Wales. Given the impact of extreme weather events, will the Prime Minister continue to prioritise coal tips to keep our communities safe?
Yes, I will, and I know how much of a concern it is to his constituents. Indeed, we went together to meet some of those constituents last time there was terrible flooding, but that commitment to the £25 million in relation to coal tips is very important. And what I would say on flooding, we've now had two questions on this. If other members of the House do have individual issues they're not able to raise here, if they get in touch with myself or my office, I'll make sure that they get whatever they need in support of their constituents.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and of course we too welcome the ceasefire in Lebanon. But now that arrest warrants have been issued for his allies, Netanyahu and Gallant, the Prime Minister's determination to supply Israel with the weapons it requires to carry out its atrocities in Gaza, which has always been morally repugnant, is now completely untenable. But what these warrants would do is present him with a perfectly valid legal avenue by which he can end the UK's complicity in this slaughter. So will he do that, or will the Prime Minister continue to choose to licence F-35 components to a regime which is now led by a man wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
We've set out our position under the current law, as he well knows. I've set out my position very, very clearly in relation to the sale of capability to Israel to defend itself against attacks such as those from Iran. And I'm very clear that we'll continue to do so.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Derby City Centre is turning the page on 14 years of Conservative decline, with a new performance venue, a new business school, and restored market hall. But across the country, we see too many empty shops and quiet high streets. This budget is putting more money into the pockets of working people to spend supporting local businesses. Will the Prime Minister commit, contrary to Conservative scaremongering, to support and protect small businesses that are the beating heart of our high streets?
They can chanter all they like. She's describing their legacy. Describing their legacy. We are turning that around. We're supporting small businesses. We're supporting the high street. We're rebuilding our country as they go backwards.
David Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Exmouth and Exeter East and our neighbours across the South West are understandably concerned about the rail disruption and potential economic damage that the HS2 construction at Old Oak Common will cause to our region for at least the next 7 years. So, will the Prime Minister please commit to producing a full mitigation plan as soon as possible to address these issues and to ensure that the South West does not lose out?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to him for raising the issue, which is of real importance to his constituents, and we have committed £30 million to mitigate the impact of the construction at Old Oak Common. Local services will be unaffected, and current plans will see services run between Exeter and London Euston. But I'm very happy again to arrange a meeting with the relevant minister if he wants that, in order to follow up on the particular concern of his constituents.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years of the Tories, our criminal justice system is on its knees, leaving just 4.4 of domestic assault cases recorded by the police, resulting in a conviction. With Monday just gone being the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, can the Prime Minister tell us what he's going to do to ensure the criminal justice system works for women and girls in North West Leicestershire and beyond?
Well, she's right to say the criminal justice system was broken by the last government, like everything else that they touched in the 14 years. Mr. Speaker, we take this extremely seriously. We've made a commitment to halving violence against women and girls. We're taking a number of measures in relation to that, piloting, for example, domestic abuse protection orders and making it clear we will introduce a standalone offence of spiking. These are some of the measures which, frankly, we ought to be able to work across the House on, because the issue is of such importance.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ukraine faces a hell of a battle on its eastern front with Russia, but on the home front, the challenge is just as great. Just facing a harsh winter, just last week it was reported that 80% of its energy infrastructure is either damaged or destroyed. They desperately need power generators and associated equipment. So will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to discuss the provision of energy aid to this important ally, Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have provided support. This is a very serious issue, £370 million of support to the energy sector in Ukraine, which is being targeted by the Russian strikes. I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister, and I'm pleased that on this issue there is unity across the House in our defence of Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After years of neglect under the previous Conservative government, GP surgeries and across North East Hampshire, they are preparing now for huge bills to pay increased employer national insurance contributions. Heart Health Partnership in Fleet estimates this will cost them 3 nursing salaries and have already reduced staff hours by 50 per week, with more cuts in January. Can the Prime Minister please tell GPs in my constituency which patient services they should cut in order to pay the bills?
Mr. Speaker, she's absolutely right that the NHS was broken by the last administration. And the Darcy report makes that absolute... They should hang their heads in shame, frankly. We are providing in the budget £22 billion of additional funding this year for our NHS. That's a huge investment in our NHS, which is much welcomed across the NHS, much needed across the NHS. We will, of course, work with GPs and consult the sector on the services they provide and the money that they're entitled to in return. And all of that funding will be confirmed in the usual way.
Johnny Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise that Labour is determined to defend the economically disastrous Conservative policies of being outside the customs union and single market. However, does the Prime Minister agree with the principle that where it is in our country's interest to maintain alignment with EU standards so we can better sell our products internationally, we align, and where it is in our interest to diverge, we diverge?
I certainly agree that the deal we got under the last government is not the best deal that we can get, and that's why we are determined to reset the relationship which we have already begun. Obviously, there will be no return to freedom of movement, the customs union or the single market, but beyond that, we can increase, I think, and improve the situation, whether it comes to trading, to security and other cooperation, and we're actively working on that.
Final question, Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Following a major fire at the Tradeby depot in my constituency in 2021, Scotland's clinical waste was forced to be transported to England due to a complete lack of forward planning. Tradeby was only appointed after the previous contractor collapsed, leaving human remains languishing in a warehouse. And it's now been revealed that the Spanish company was bailed out with £5.4 million of taxpayers' money. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the SNP government has consistently failed to get a grip of clinical waste disposal and must act appropriately to protect the public purse and ensure public safety?
Well, I do agree with that, and it's not. It's the rule rather than exception when it comes to the SNP government. And the challenge for them now is they've got the powers to act. They've now been given the money to act. They've run out of excuses.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We'll let the front benches change over.